Fact number one, every individual will face God's judgment after his mortal life ends. Fact number two, mortal life is relatively insignificant compared to future eternity. Fact number three, every human being is either, who's flipping the numbers? Don't do that. Let me do this. I'm in charge. Thanks, Ken. Okay. Fact number three, every human being is either a child of Satan or a child of God. Fact number four, every human being, saved or unsaved, will be resurrected after death. And fact number five, heaven and hell are only temporary waiting places. Well, let's work through these truths one by one. They will build a foundation for next Sunday's message. And we'll take a closer look at the details of what await each one of us on the other side of death. So let's start with fact number one. Let's see if it works. Okay. Every individual will face God's judgment after his mortal life ends. Now, Solomon has already called this fact to our attention when he said, quote, "The spirit will return to God who gave it." Listen now to the words of the author of the book of Hebrews in chapter 9, verse 27. He says, "It is appointed once for a man to die, and after this, the judgment." Now, do you see what he's saying? Each one of us in this room has an appointment with our Creator. He made us. He gave us the gift of mortal life. He placed it in our hands as a stewardship. For every one of us, a day will come when, after we die, we will stand before God to give an account of how we lived our lives. The most important question that God will ask us at that time will not involve our educational achievements or our financial portfolios. It won't have to do with who we married. It won't even involve the ways in which we have failed per se. The question that he will ask will reflect the fact that every one of us is a sinner. None of us is free of guilt. The most important question that he will ask will be this: what have you done with regard to my son? We'll give more attention to this matter of facing God's judgment in our message next Sunday. But let's move on now to fact number two. Mortal life is relatively insignificant compared to eternity. Now, if you believe, as I do, that the human spirit is immortal, in other words, if you believe the Bible's declaration that our spirits will never die, even when our bodies die, this fact is obvious. Mortal life is finite. Few of us in this room are going to reach the age of 100 before our bodies fail. Now, my wife's grandmother lived to be 105, and she was clear-headed to the end, but even she died. And in comparison to the never-ending ages of future eternity that are before us, the brief span of our mortal lives is definitely relatively insignificant. But understanding that fact intellectually and facing its practical ramifications are two different things. Our mortal lives, our daily lives, the things that you and I are experiencing in our lives right now here on earth, are filled with things that naturally occupy our attention. We have the struggle to make a living. We have the pursuit of education and a career. We have the hunt for a mate. The search for a purpose and a role in the world. And the joys and sorrows of interpersonal relationships. And the simple pleasures and hardships of living in these mortal bodies. All of these things naturally capture our attention. We find it difficult to remember that as challenging and attention-grabbing as the events of our daily lives are, mortal life is merely a door through which each one of us will enter eternity. Now, Jesus was referring to this fact when he spoke the familiar words of Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 to 21. Listen. Do not lay up for yourself treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Now, do you see how practical our Lord's counsel here is? The key to keeping a healthy focus on eternity is recognizing that whatever we achieve on earth is only temporary. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, the Apostle Paul was reflecting on the hardships that he had experienced in his ministry, and particularly during his missionary journeys. As you probably know, he was arrested, he was beaten, he was shipwrecked several times, he was even stoned and left for dead. But as he reflected on these extremely unpleasant experiences, he kept them in balance by reminding himself of the future of blessedness that God had promised to him because he was a follower of Jesus Christ. So I want you to listen to 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 16 to 18. Therefore, we do not lose heart. Even though our outward man is perishing, yet the inward man is being renewed day by day. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory, while we do not look at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporary, but the things which are not seen are eternal. The point that Paul is making here is clear. Mortal life is only temporary, but how we live these temporary lives will determine how we spend our unending future eternities. So let's move on now to fact number 3. Every human being, every person, is either a child of Satan or a child of God. Now, this truth may be hard to stomach, but it is undeniable. In reality, there's no such thing as a person who is neutral with regard to God. Every human being is either the enemy of God and the child of Satan, or the enemy of Satan and the child of God. Jesus affirmed this truth over and over again. For example, in Matthew chapter 12, verse 30, during his dispute with the Pharisees, Jesus made this statement: "He who is not with me is against me, and he who does not gather with me scatters abroad." Here he clearly states that there's no middle ground. Jesus made this statement, or this fact, even more clear in his interaction with the Pharisees in John chapter 8, verses 42 to 45. And the Pharisees to whom he was speaking were definitely his opponents. He said, "If God were your Father, you would love me, for I proceeded forth and came from God. Nor have I come of myself, but he sent me. Why do you not understand my speech? Because you are not able to listen to my word. You are of your father the devil, and the desires of your father you want to do. He was a murderer from the beginning, and does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own resources, for he is a liar and the father of it. But because I tell you the truth, you do not believe me." And do you notice what it is that determines whether or not an individual is a child of God? What determines whether he's a child of Satan or a child of God? It's very simple, really. Those who reject what God says as lies are the children of Satan. Those who accept the truth of what God says become his children by their very acceptance of the truth. We see the same idea in the words of the Apostle John in 1 John chapter 5, verse 10. Listen to what he says. He who believes in the Son of God has the witness in himself. He who does not believe God has made him a liar. Now that's a Greek way of saying he who does not believe God has called God a liar. Why? John continues, because he has not believed the testimony that God has given of his Son. We see the same truth repeated at the end of John chapter 3 in verse 36 with these words. He who believes the Son has everlasting life. And he who does not believe the Son shall not see life, but the wrath of God remains on him. So listen again to fact number 3. Every person is either a child of Satan or a child of God. Now let me state that in a slightly different way. Every person enters life as a child of Satan. This is true of every one of us from the moment of our conception. Now perhaps you're thinking, no, that can't be true. That can't be true about babies. Well, my answer to you is yes, babies are cute. Babies are cuddly. Babies are sweet. My wife and I have 2 granddaughters. One of them was born about 8 weeks ago. They are the cutest things. My wife just looks at their pictures and starts giggling. We love them. But babies are not innocent. Babies are by their nature sinners just like us. The only difference between us and them is that they haven't had as much time as we have had to perfect our technique. One preacher described babies this way. He said, babies are vipers in diapers. I love that expression. I love it. The fact of the matter is that we all start as children of Satan. And the only way to stop being Satan's child and to become God's child is through believing the gospel, through faith in Jesus Christ. Well, that brings us to fact number 4. Every human being, saved or unsaved, will be resurrected after death. Now, for most people, there will be a gap in time between their death and resurrection. We'll come back to that truth later, perhaps next week. But for now, let's focus on this 4th fact. The fact that everyone, saved or unsaved, will receive an immortal resurrection body. Now, back in Daniel chapter 12, Daniel has something to say along these lines. Verse 2, he says, and many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. Now, 2 ideas call for our attention here. First, when an individual is resurrected, only one of 2 destinies will await him.